transformative experience, there are three important phases. And the first phase is preparation. The second one is the experience itself. And the third one is the processing afterwards. Now, it doesn't make any difference which medium we are using. These three phases will always be there.
It's just absolutely clear to me that consciousness is not possibly the product of the brain. It exists or can exist independently of the body, and that it's at least an equal partner, or possibly supraordinated to the world of matter.
By contemplating the images of mythology, we get in touch with those powers within ourselves.
It's very fine. I'm going to step off the limb now.
We are animals. We are beautiful, living mammals on a garden planet. Feeling the pleasure and the joy and the ecstasy of that reality is our birthright.
It took 14 billion years on this planet for evolution to create a species capable of understanding evolution and capable of understanding nature, the atom, the gene, the brain, such that we can either co-destroy or co-evolve.
The journey is about to begin.
Noosphere, the hyperorganism consisting of the interconnected totality of all sentient beings and the higher level of consciousness possessed by it.
The planet doesn't have any problems except people. What we are experiencing, the global crisis, is really reflecting somehow the level of consciousness evolution in the species. I mean, if we could have our heads and hearts in a different place, you know, the planet could look very, very different.
Joseph Campbell did so much to bring to our consciousness the fact that the world's mythology, as vast as it is has a single theme running through so much of it, of the hero's journey. And he saw three phases to this hero's journey: separation, initiation, and return.
Exploration of the stranger and odder areas of the human mind. I mean, this is one of the things which has emerged, I think, in recent years. Not only is the material universe incomparably larger and stranger than we used to give it any credit for, but the mental universe is also larger and stranger than we give it credit for. That we carry about inside our skulls an extraordinary world, a visionary world, a mystical world.
In terms of the times we live in, we have opportunities for spiritual growth and development that never existed before in the world. We have the whole world's spiritual riches potentially available to us. Now, the way it's almost always been when most people never went more than 20 miles from their home village is you were lucky if there was a spiritual teacher around at all, and you were lucky if the way that teacher taught fitted your personality at all, so you could actually get somewhere with it.
We have a way of sort of valuing the rational aspects of our intellect and subordinating and actually sort of eradicating these kinds of experiences like intuition or direct knowing from children.
We're living in a very interesting time. The civilization that we call Western techno-industrial civilization is simultaneously becoming global and collapsing. As far as we know, historically, that's never happened before on this planet. I mean, civilizations have collapsed before. Rome collapsed. It collapsed from inside. Why? Because it depleted the granaries, the North African granaries. You have no bread to feed the soldiers. Forget it. The military, your military won't fight if they don't get fed. They didn't think about that, you see. The military, the empire always wants to expand, right? It's just like now. Just expand. We can do it. We got the greatest military in the world. Well, it's not going to do you any good, you see. If you can't feed the soldiers, you can't pay for it. There's elements within the culture that want to keep things the same. That's true of the economy and politics too, see. People who have power want to keep power. People who have wealth want to keep the wealth. That's the primary motivation. Capitalism, what's called the neoliberal model, is a dysfunctional system. It's not life sustainable. It doesn't support all of life. Half the population on the planet is living at a poverty level. 1 billion people who are permanently hungry. Tens of thousands of families who live full-time on a trash dump in Manila or Mexico City. You can't by any stretch of the imagination call that a civilization. The ecosystems on the entire planet are being stressed and overstressed to the maximum of their carrying capacity. Population is increasing exponentially, so vastly increasing demand on ever decreasing resources. It's a runaway system.
The best estimates are that a quarter of mammal species will be extinct in 30 years. Half of all species of life will be extinct in 100 years. All species of the next couple of decades are going to see tremendous dislocations and turbulence.
We are an integral part of nature. In some sense, the human being is like an expression of nature, which nature sort of perceives itself. It's like a sort of extension, of nature, and deeply embedded in nature and interconnected. And this is something that we lost, the awareness of this embeddedness and of this connection.
Shaman is one in contact with the spirit world. Who is this like for us in the West? This is like Christ, Buddha, any of the awakened ones who have traversed the full spectrum of being.
Myth itself was probably formed out of the initial shamanic experience of going out into these other worlds and having these otherworld experiences and coming back. And I think one of the main things that the shaman actually does is bring those experiences down into language.
Shamanism, a worldview within which mediation between physical and spirit dimensions becomes possible through ecstatic states of consciousness.
The study, the appreciation, and to some extent the sharing of shamanic experience is an important bridge back to a consciousness, which was the dominant one many thousands of years ago.
The basic principle of shamanism, I come to understand it when it's stripped of the cultural particularities, is the use of entering an altered state of consciousness, an expanded state of consciousness, and for the purposes of obtaining knowledge, for healing, or seeking guidance or vision.
Several of the earliest mystery cults in the Greco-Roman world were catalyzed by contact between Greek culture and a shamanic culture to the north of Greece, in places like Thrace and Scythia. And around the 7th century BC, the argument goes, trade routes opened up between Greece and these northern regions, and the Greeks came in contact with shaman-like characters. The principal feature of shamanism is that the shaman is able to leave his or her body. It's called ecstasy, ecstasis, to stand outside the body. The shaman has something inside him or her that is detachable from the body, that can leave. And this is the source of the shaman's ability to heal, to bring esoteric knowledge back to his or her people from other realms. The Greeks, when they encountered this phenomenon, seem to have generalized it in a way that the shamans themselves hadn't. And among the Orphics and the Pythagoreans especially, came to be believed that not just the shaman, but all human beings, in some sense, possessed this fundamental duality, that not only within the shaman, but within everybody, there is something that is detachable from the body, that is not made of matter, that especially is not born when the body is born and does not die when the body dies. That's something that it was given a name, and the name was psyche in Greek. Psyche is how we pronounce it now, and the word means soul. And this is the origin, as far as scholars are able to determine, of the concept of the human soul in the history of Western thought. And so there seems to be a very mysterious shamanic catalytic element in the formation of the soul concept in Western civilization. And this then gets taken up by Plato. That becomes an absolutely central part of his philosophical system and worldview that then serves as the foundation for the subsequent history of Western thought.
So just at a sensory level, a culture that is in harmony with its environment is more attuned to the subtleties of the environment in which it exists. When you go into the Amazon, just at the material level, you know, we think of food as something that comes from the grocery store, you know, they're able to see subtle things in the forest that from our untrained eye are invisible.
If a plant at, say, 3,000 feet elevation up the side of the volcano comes into bloom in, late April, then people who are up there gathering herbs recognize, when that blossom comes into bloom, that means that that particular little fish down in the tide pools down the coast will also come in, and it's a time to go catch that fish. So they've got a system of watching how the whole network of life forms are creating this calendrical signaling system. And then wherever you are, if you're tuned in enough to know that system, to have recognized it through generations and generations of observation, then you know how to steward, really, how to take what you need and take care of all of these different parts of that complex system. That's the level of attention that ideally we should be paying to nature right here.
Shamanism is extremely important for several reasons. One is that it's one of the best ways to give the dominant culture a way of seeing that the natural world and human nature are not so encased as the current paradigm would suggest. Amazing things happen and can happen and even can be made to happen. There are other dimensions, there are other beings, other ways of knowing, other ways of experiencing. And there are rules and procedures which makes this happen.
It's interesting that they use two metaphors for shamans or descriptions. One, they call them trackers. That's like also called soul retrieval, or it's like psychotherapy, or like diagnosis of an illness, you see. The other metaphor they use is spirit lawyer. They say problems arise in a family, or we would call psychological problems, and sometimes physical illnesses, because we've offended their spirits in some way, or we've failed to acknowledge them properly. And the shaman being the one who knows the spirit world and how to access it, and who knows the songs and the names of the spirits. That's like having the access code, you know, in computer language, or the telephone number, how to get hold of these people, these beings. The spirits of the environment, like the waterfall or the forest or the river, or, you know, and so we don't do that. You know, if we went to a shaman and he might say, well, your problems come from the pollution in the river. You guys need to clean up the river. How can you expect to be healthy? You know, our worldview in terms of healing involves when you're ill, you go to the doctor, and the doctor gives you a pill or does a surgery, and then, you know, takes something out or puts something in to your system. So supposing you live in a South American community and you feel out of sorts, you go to the shaman. He or she might take ayahuasca before he gives you anything, in order to see what is the origin of the illness by using expanded perception. Then he's likely to express that in symbolic languages. He might talk about the serpent, or wouldn't necessarily say viruses or anything like that. And he might talk, very often he'll talk about sorcery. Like somebody has negative intention to you and sent you a little dart. Now we think that's ridiculous, no, sorcery doesn't exist. But what it is it's a recognition of the power of thought. So every time you think a thought, you're affecting the consciousness of everyone who comes into contact with that thought, including the collective. So every time we think a thought, for example, that's why programming in the media is such a phenomenally impactful course. We participate in it and we feed that system and we're fed by it. And just think of the multiplication of thought forms and images that stimulate you to buy stuff, and that's the salvation of happiness.
Disenchantment, the radical dislocation of the ground of meaning from the world as conscious intelligence to the human self alone.
New media and technologies have been a great boon to humanity, but at the same time, there's a great distancing between ourselves and reality. All kinds of filters go up. Through our disenchantment with the natural world.
In tribal cultures, there's often rites of passage. It's almost universal that young men and young women will have initiatory experiences that will introduce them to the other world. And definitely losing our connection to those kind of rites of passage has, I think, been a huge problem for our society. And it's something that it's very hard to bring back artificially.
One of the characteristics of the modern world, the modernity, is that the universe is disenchanted. It's a very, very important concept. The Earth, the galaxies, even in a certain sense, the world of plants and animals is disenchanted. So there are many ways that this disenchantment happened in the last 400 years or so. Similarly, there are many attempts to re-enchant.
What Weber specifically meant by disenchantment is the modern mind's assumption that everything about the world is ultimately understandable in such a way that it can be calculated, predicted, and potentially controlled. That quality of mystery and soul has been withdrawn. One way of kind kind of showing the difference would be to take the primal perspective. When a primal person, from traditional indigenous cultures, when they would walk out into the world, they would experience spirits in the forest and presences in the wind and in the ocean.
The worldviews of the pre-industrial cultures all have tremendous spiritual focus. Spirituality is an important dimension of existence. Besides what we perceive in everyday life, there are also invisible dimensions of reality, sort of inhabited by, what we can call today archetypal beings, realms that have sort of this archetypal mythological dimension.
Archetype, an autonomous form in the primordial psyche that structures and impels all human behavior and experience.
Well, archetypes are principles that really inform the whole history of Western thought. I mean, it's kind of the concept around which Western philosophy and later psychology revolves. Behind the Platonic understanding are the gods and goddesses of the ancient imagination, so that you have basically, let's say with beauty, it's personified as Aphrodite in the Greek mythic imagination. In the Platonic understanding, in the ancient understanding, the entire cosmos can be seen as governed in this way. But by the time you get to the modern era, archetypal principles, or gods and goddesses, are seen as the result of human projection or human generalizations. Our mind imposes on the chaos of phenomena certain ordering principles which ultimately come from the subject. So from this primal point of view, there is a continuity between the human interior consciousness and the interior of the world. And the human being can participate in the soul of the world because the world is ensouled.
The Western worldview is very, very different. The pragmatic, materialistic worldview is very different. The only reality is the material world. These other dimensions that the native cultures are interested in, they are either sort of result of some kind of a lack of education, primitive magical thinking, or they are outright psychopathology. It involves direct experiences of these states.
The primal perspective is enchanted, and the modern perspective is that of a disenchanted world. Now, how did this shift happen? I mean, what I've just described is something that is particularly evident from the time of Descartes. Later, 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th century, science and philosophy is basically disenchanted, by and large, with the exceptions of the religious statements that Einstein will make, or that you have a Whitehead or a Teilhard. But by and large, modern science has disenchantment built right into its essential point of view.
The Achuar peoples are also interesting because they practice collective dreaming. Every morning they wake up and they share the content of their dreams. And they do this because they believe that nobody dreams for the individual. I mean, they have individual dreams, but their larger purpose is to help them understand the collective experience. So a person will wake up in the morning and they'll share a bit of their dream, and then somebody else will share, and somebody else will share, and it's usually the elder of the household unit that then interprets this. And they come up with a collective interpretation of their individual experiences in such a way that they use it to predict their practice. So should they go hunting today? Should they go fishing? Will there be visitors? Should they travel? Will there be danger? These kinds of insights about the future come through the sharing of dreams. So it's not just a luxury to share your dreams with one another, but it's actually a social responsibility. So subjectivity is highly honored and esteemed for its reliability, rather than suspect for its unreliability because it can't be easily measured.
The modern disenchanted perspective didn't emerge completely ex nihilo with the 17th century and Descartes. It was prepared for by the whole evolution of Homo sapiens, going back to the first use of tools, the first linguistic and religious symbolizations. You begin to have the differentiation of the human self as a subject acting upon the world as an object. So that's kind of begins the whole process that leads to the kind of radical disenchantment that we have in our time, the objectification of the world.
We have been living in a society that separates us, and we assume that, you know, as a human being, we are these isolated entities contained within this skin and, you know, this body. And yet other cultures see it very differently. And there are more and more reasons to believe that it is a more relational rather than isolated world we live in. And relational at some really core fundamental levels. You know, it's not only about recognizing the importance of living in society and living in right relationship in terms of our social intercourse, but really recognizing that perhaps we are all part of a more complex, interconnected system that isn't simply physical, but that actually may have some metaphysical or transpersonal components or qualities.
Well, the notion of an interconnected world rather than a world of objects is you know, both new and old, very old. Thomas Berry said, we're moving from a world seen as a collection of objects to a world recognized as a communion of subjects. When you recognize that everything has its own inherent subjectivity, that is consciousness, that is spirit. That's what the native indigenous people, shamanistic societies would say. Everything has spirit and consciousness. And you treat it that way. Not quite correct to say it's communication, because communication applies A to B. Communion is much closer than that. See, and as spirits, we commune always telepathically with another being. We merge our consciousness. We merge our consciousness. It's sort of like love. You feel like you're in the same consciousness as somebody else.
Interconnectivity is the ascending archetype, I think, of the 21st century, 21st century, this discovery of this profound interlaced quality of existence at all physical and spiritual and mental, psychological levels.
The modern worldview is being replaced by, some people call it a postmodern, but I think it's ridiculous. You could say it's a systems worldview. And the modern worldview is mechanistic and atomistic and linear causality and quantitative, and the only real realm is the realm of measurable objects and forces. Everything else, that means images in your mind, thoughts, intuitions, imaginations, symbols, anything that, dreams, anything that is merely subjective. Values is merely subjective. Values are not objective. Therefore we can have a science that can make bombs and obliterate thousands, all this kind of thing, and devastate the atmosphere, and we can say, well, we're scientists, we don't deal with values, that's politics, you see, and economics.
Our crisis is a birth. It's a birth of this new humanity that's been prefigured in the mystics, but now going to be pressured by the crisis. It took all of those years for the crisis to mature.
Entrainment, the phenomenon whereby energy systems tend to become harmonic while in proximity.
Rhythm and dance, you know, are among the most primal expressions of a culture and of the communal tribal bonds.
Music may be older than language, so in a sense, music may be the most ancient of human activities, and it very well may be the case that it is one of the things that makes us human, that began to distinguish us from our hominid ancestors in terms of music. One is the late ethnomusicologist John Blacking. He had this kind of interesting idea, what he calls proto-music and proto-dance, and his idea is that the origins of music were not functional. The origins of music were ecstatic in nature. And so essentially what he was proposing is that there would be rudimentary rhythms that they would play, and they would have these ecstatic experiences dancing, and then they would just sort of spontaneously emit these sounds that the body produces when you're in an ecstatic state. And he really feels that this is the origin of singing and vocalization and so on and so forth.
There are multiple ways of knowing in consciousness, so it takes multiple forms. We often think about it as a rational, in the brain kind of sort of definition for consciousness, but it's also clear in studying the various aspects of the body that the heart, for example, has its own intelligence and its own way of knowing. It's a very strong electrical field. There are ways in which the heart and one person's heart and another person's heart can actually become entrained when they're in proximity. So this begins to lead toward the idea of our connections and the kind of collective consciousness that can occur, from our heads and our hearts, and hopefully from our souls and beyond.
In Aboriginal cultures, and even in our postmodern kind of recreations of raves and festival culture, music and rhythm are a driving connective force that creates a kind of collective entrainment.
But the basic beat functions to entrain for what's called rhythmic entrainment or auditory driving of brainwave beats, the alpha wave and the theta wave.
In other words, we're sitting here right now, I have my brain state, you have your brain state. They may or may not be similar to each other, but if I put on a rhythmic piece of music and we start tapping our feet in rhythm to it, then essentially it's a very effective way of training us to enter a similar brain state.
When people gather together and resonate on the same frequency, everyone's brought into alignment with the beat.
I think on another level, this whole question of entrainment is really interesting. So I would say one thing that we're going through in our culture now is entrainment to and through technology. That people are being entrained by the internet, by cellular communication, by the whole mediated superstructure that we're enmeshed in. And to me, that almost seems like part of a process of creating a global mind or a kind of new spirit consciousness that may be part of this initiatory process into a next level of human consciousness.
Entrainment means that all the rhythms come to be harmonic to each other, not necessarily the same beat, but harmonic to each other. And then if numerous people doing it at the same time, you have the beats of the different people, the rhythms of the different people being harmonic with each other, as well as like you would have in choral chanting, and they're harmonic. They're not singing the same note, that's not the point, but they're harmonic and therefore resonant with one another, so it would produce tremendous feelings of oneness and bonding among people, regardless of the content. See, they may be thinking different thoughts and having different pictures and going on at mind. That's the basic idea. What's the DJ doing, or the musicians? They're driving. They're like the conductor, basically, of the whole theme. So, just like a symphony orchestra has a conductor, make sure everybody's on the same page and playing the same time and tempo and so on. The difference between a dance, like a rave, is that there's not the musicians, the performers, and the audience. This basic drum beat is the basic method when you do a shamanic journey without drugs. There's a certain beat you use to travel on, and then there's a signal that you get that means stop, and then there's a fast beat that means come back to your starting point. Because that's the whole point. You want to come back to your starting point. It's always an going in, really, and then a return journey with the knowledge or the information that you obtained. But it was interesting to me to see that when you look at cross-culturally, the studies of the mushroom shamans in Mexico or the Native American church, or the ayahuasca churches in Brazil, they use singing, but it's always rhythmic singing. You listen to Maria Sabina do her chants, and it's like the ayahuasca thing is the same. The peyote one too, a little faster sometimes. What does that do? That means you keep going, you see. It encourages you to keep going. And therefore counteracts the tendency you might have to get hung up, either distracted or seduced by something, or terrified or paralyzed by something. You just keep going. Through entrainment, that would be similar to when you're choral singing and chanting together. In addition, the rhythm, I think, has another function in terms of shamanic journeys, divination journeys, in the sense that, and this is why in the European cultures, you see, they say, the shamanic cultures, they say the drum beat is the horse. And it's the vehicle. And when you're listening to the drum beat, it furthers your concentration. You have something to concentrate on. It's like as soon as you hear the drum, then you'll be reminded of what the purpose is. And you're reminded of what you're doing. Oh yes, I'm on it. Let me get back to what I'm doing.
To look at the history of these West African possession religions as they come over to the Americas in the slave trade, and of course they are not allowed to practice these religions in the form with which they are accustomed. So for example, in the United States the drum was outlawed. The only place in the United States where the drum wasn't outlawed was New Orleans.
People in a drumming circle or in an ecstatic dance setting are connecting themselves with the continuous legacy of the incarnation of vitality in the form of Homo sapiens.
Oral skill in African American culture, and you can trace it all the way back to West Africa, the griot or the Jolly tradition, where these were sort of court poets who had a sacred function and memorized these long poems of thousands or tens of thousands of words and so forth, and it goes through various street lingo in African American culture, and you can even see it in people like Malcolm X or Martin Luther King Jr. or Muhammad Ali, or where there's this kind of function of sacred language. And this is where the word flow comes in, because essentially they're improvising and they're just and so there's a certain level that you get to where your conscious mind just sort of steps out of the way and the words just flow.
We have, I think, for the last 40,000 years, since self-consciousness had been developing individuality. And maybe the whole development of ego is necessary in order for us to become individuals who are not embedded in nature and just purely children of God. So out of that, we have individuated right up to the edge of individualization destroying us. Now, the way we become multicellular, the way we join together, is first of all by individuals feeling the need to find that divine self within, because you can't really join as an ego with ego.
There are many ways you can induce these non-ordinary states. We had, about 8 years ago, we had a conference in the Amazon in Manaus, the International Transpersonal Association. And the conference was called The Technologies of the Sacred, Ancient, Aboriginal and Modern, where we explore these many different ways you can change your consciousness and induce these states. So psychedelics are not, the only way. You can do it by fasting, by dancing, by sensory deprivation. We developed the holotropic breathwork, where you can use different things related to breath to really change your consciousness. And music and sound, particularly percussion, specific frequencies, are one of the most powerful ways of inducing these states. So there are many Aboriginal cultures that can use just these non-drug techniques and get people into very profound trances. And if you combine it now with psychedelics, you get a very powerful package.
No doubt, Paleolithic people were drumming and dancing and feeling that ecstasy. And in doing it ourselves, we are reconnecting with the root of our being that we have lost.
Religious traditions have, throughout the centuries, throughout the millennia, have used psychedelic substances with religious ritual and for transformation.
Rite of passage. Any ritual or ceremony wherein a participant crosses a threshold, demarcating a transformation of their state of being.
It was tremendous loss for our culture when we sort of discarded the rites of passage. It's really responsible for much of the pathology in our culture. We see it, today, particularly in the situation where young people create their own, frequently, not so constructive rite of passage, but there's a need somehow that they feel for some ritual events, and if they are not being offered in a sanctioned way by the culture, they create their own.
In most archaic and non-literate cultures, there is some form of initiation into adult society, and it can take the form of an ordeal, abandonment in the wilderness, or a psychedelic experience. And in cultures that use psychedelics, this is one of the things they've traditionally used them for. And to me, what it means is when you are finally old enough to take psychedelics, you are old enough to step behind the cultural mask. You're now learning that all those fascinating spirits, demons, and magical phenomena are in fact effects in the hands of technicians and theologians who are guiding the society. So in a way, in these archaic societies, what's being said is you're not fully informed as to how society works and as to how your own body works until you have assimilated this lesson. It's similar to sexuality, but unlike sexuality, it's not biologically determined or scripted into life's story. So it's sort of something which must be brought forward by intent.
The potential that entheogens have for rites of initiation is great. I was 21 when I took LSD for the first time, and I'm glad I waited. I think it did introduce me to a new potential that I formerly was unaware of.
It seems that because we're in this sort of postmodern vacuum, in a sense, where we've lost our connection to ancient practices, initiatory cultures, it's almost like there's a kind of spontaneous reemergence of these forms or an attempt to recreate them. So we see this with rave culture, with Burning Man, with all these festivals and so on.
Another function of the rite of passage is to give these initiates kind of empirical evidence for the worldview that the culture looks with, that there are really these other dimensions. And this is very different from what happened in the 60s. You know, people in our culture who had these experiences, they got alienated from their culture because suddenly their worldview was completely different. You know, they're living in this pragmatic, materialistic culture, and they suddenly have a kind of a mystical worldview. So there's a very problematic handling of that interface.
Because modern Western science won't deal with the subjective at all, because they say you can't deal with the subjective objectively. And that's a mistake. That's a historical accident, you know, of the way science developed out of the split between science and religion in the 16th century, where the scientists needed to find out, you know, they needed to find a way to work with the church, because the church was the controller of knowledge. They were the ruling ideology of the time, literally, what the Pope... So Galileo had to work it out with the church, you know. He couldn't say, as he tried to say, look to the Vatican guys, you know, look through the telescope. I said that Jupiter has moons, and they said, no, we don't need to look through your stupid telescope. We know Jupiter doesn't have any moons, because if it did, Aristotle would have told us so.
My hope was that science and the scientific method and Western approach, which was disconnected and unbalanced, but that if we could merge it with these technologies that brought forth the unconscious, and look at them with the scientific method, that together, pairing those things together, that we can help people heal from emotional wounds and also from a primary identification with their race or their religion or their country or their gender.
The discovery of psychedelic effects of LSD and the discovery of the atomic energy, you know, an atomic bomb came at approximately the same time within the Second World War, and so many people speculate that as humanity was moving, you know, to this possibility of complete destruction of life on Earth, there's also an instrument, a tool came in that could sort of reverse that destructive and self-destructive course.
Huxley's vision, and he anticipated that in the 60s psychedelics could not be tolerated, that our society was not ready, that they could not have these potent catalysts of change prevalent within the culture, and certainly much of the upheaval of the 60s, certainly a little appreciated force to the cultural turmoil, the counterculture, the political opposition movements, was the fact that millions of people had on their own experimented with psychedelics.
Ramdas, you know, the former kind of psychedelic researcher who was fired together with Leary and Ralph Metzner from Harvard, and he, as a result of his experiences, ended up in India with Karoli Baba, a very powerful guru. And when they discussed LSD, his guru said, you know, the Western culture is so enmeshed in the material world that it had to be something very powerful that came in, and had to come in some kind of material form for that, in a way that the Western culture understands, but at the same time that is powerful enough to awaken, you know, them from this kind of hypnotic fascination with the world of matter.
I think what we found in the 1960s was a kind of attempt at a modern mass cultural voyage of shamanic initiation. So it was a kind of reaccessing of these deep mythic structures that the modern world had lost.
It's not until a person has a mystical experience that they wake up to this entire dimension of being. And then it's very real because they've had an experience of it. They've looked through the microscope or the telescope. Now we're in a condition where we can be initiated into these worlds.
Concrescence, the process through which seemingly dissimilar phenomena are integrated into a coherent whole.
All of the technologies that we think of as the modern internet and the personal computers were really created first in an area around Stanford University between 1960 and 1975, at the same time that there was both a vibrant counterculture and ideas about augmenting human intelligence, augmenting the human mind, were being pursued both by the technologists, and they were sort of alive in a lot of the counterculture community that was taking place around Stanford. The technology didn't emerge in the vacuum. Technology is actually mediated by things that are going on in society, whether they be politics or economics or culture. In 1965, 1966, there were two men on either side of the Stanford campus. One was John McCarthy and one was Doug Engelbart. McCarthy was leading a research group that wanted to replace the human mind. He was exploring these technologies called artificial intelligence. And artificial intelligence at that time, the researchers thought that they could create a computerized artificial intelligence in a decade. On the other side of the campus, Engelbart was doing something different. He was trying to augment the human mind. He was trying to build a set of technologies that would allow humans to cooperate more quickly and invent things more efficiently. I've really struggled to try to understand what the relationship is between the use of psychedelic drugs by a small community of people during the 60s and the development of computer technology. And I'm still uncomfortable by saying one led to the other. It's clear to me, however, that they both emerged at the same time, and there were aspects of each that resonated. Doug Engelbart had this idea about amplifying the human mind. The people who were exploring LSD during the 1960s wanted to expand the human mind. Those were very similar ideas, and the impetus was related, and they resonated back and forth. And I think it's possible to say that each side drew on the other for sort of vision and inspiration. The threads that were emerging in California on the edge of the United States in the 60s led to both, and I think it's not a coincidence. They both happened, within the space of 5 miles. The interesting thing about Engelbart is that he was willing to experiment with all kinds of ideas, from psychodrama to psychedelic drugs, to new computer technologies, to ideas that were taken from Mao's Red Guards. And so it was a wild and unusual time. I mean, if you went into SRI back in the 60s, on one floor you'd have these guys with white shirts and pocket protectors who were designing smart missiles. And on Engelbart's floors you'd have, Oriental rugs and pillows and yoga workstations and wine and drugs in the refrigerator. Just a very different cultural atmosphere. And out of that came most of the important ideas that would become personal computing. In 1968, in December, Engelbart sort of brought everything that his research group had developed during the 60s together in one just amazing demonstration that was given at Brooks Hall at the Joint Qual Computer Conference. He had a huge screen, a video screen, which was very unusual at that point to have an interactive video screen. And he sat up on stage, and he had a mouse in one hand, a keyboard. He had a display for himself. He had this thing called a chord key set that allowed him to enter textual information with his left hand while he was mousing with his right. And on the screen he had windows and hypertext and all the visual stuff that would become sort of the modern computer interface. And you have to remember that at that time, computing was not interactive. You would take your stack of cards and you would hand them to the sort of high priest of the data center. And Engelbart blew all that up. He showed 1,000 of the best computer scientists in the country a very different model of computing.
And everything was different after that demonstration. It was called the mother of all demos. And what's significant is that a lot of his ideas emerged not just from sort of a pure set of technology events, but from this real sort of open exploratory group that he put together in the midst of both a political and a drug counterculture.
Ecological crisis is taking place, and that more global consciousness is taking place, and that psychedelic awakening is taking place, and feminism. All these things are happening. One other thing takes place, and that is the first view of the Earth from outside the Earth, beyond its atmosphere, and some human beings, who represent, in a sense, all human beings, have been in a position of being able to look back on the Earth, and then photographs have been brought back, which we've all seen. A perspective is given that was simply impossible before.
In the 60s we were born. We got off the planet and we saw ourselves as a living body. We had the Beatles music, we had the substances that expanded our consciousness, we had the awakening of the women, and we had the environmental movement. All of this late 60s, early 70s. And we began to realize that we're overpopulating and polluting. We didn't even know that until around the 60s. We're learning we have to coordinate as a planetary body. We didn't have to do that before. We were all separate.
Medicine. Any mediation necessary to correct a diseased state of being.
Obviously, Americans are least of any people in the world afraid of drugs, because there's a drugstore on every corner. So if they are so afraid of mind-expanding drugs, obviously it's the mind expansion that they are afraid of. And we are made afraid of mind expansion by precisely the people who have a vested interest in our minds being quite narrow.
What's happening is these chemicals have the capacity to expand consciousness in ways that we're just not accustomed to thinking. So it's opening up the envelope of consciousness into new territories for us to think about and to try to imagine.
In many respects, the war on drugs was fueled by the fears of Tim Leary and what he had to say, and the surging use of psychedelics by youth during the 1960s.
The young generation with these states had many dimensions. That, one of it was certainly that aesthetic aspect, just the beautiful display, but there was also an element of tremendous freedom, sort of disinhibition. All the sort of cultural restrictions being kind of a Dionysian element, breaking into consciousness. And then I think even if people did not have specific healing intention, that something within them felt there was a kind of a therapeutic potential, that you could heal. You could heal emotionally, you could heal psychosomatically. And then, of course, there was that other dimension, which is the opening of the spiritual aspects of life.
Native peoples around the world have developed structures and rituals which optimize safety. And there's a lot to be learned. There's a lot to be learned about how critical set and setting is to outcome. Also, intention, why individuals undertaking these kinds of experiences. And with some substances, I think it's very important that young people understand that these are not recreational compounds. They're very serious. They're considered sacred medicines by many peoples around the world.
In the United States of America, 300,000 U.S. citizens ingest a Schedule I substance legally as their sacrament. This is literally the non-drug use of peyote. It's a religious sacrament, it's not a drug.
The plant hallucinogens in particular have profound implications for the treatment of addictive disorders. There's a good deal of interest in the West African plant Iboga. Personally, I believe ayahuasca might prove to be the ideal plant concoction.
One that is in the works is to offer MDMA to people who are with advanced stage cancer and be given a prognosis of less than 12 months of remaining life. If it helps, as I think it might, and cuts down on anxiety, and may actually cut down on the need for pain medications, which means that they're less sedated, they're more alert, they have more ability to be cognitively with it. That's really important for those individuals and their family.
For the last 4 years, I've been working to develop a protocol for MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for post-traumatic stress disorder.
This paradigm was not acceptable 35, 40, 45 years ago. Are we at that point in time now where we will be able, in a sanctioned manner, to move this field forward?
At least get rid of the fear and find a setting within which this can be done safely and carefully, thoughtfully.
We had many powerful technologies of consciousness. We know very easily how to alter consciousness, how to go to different states, but bridging that gap between what we find there and our everyday reality and everyday life, that has been the challenge. People go there, find love, find compassion, find transformation, but then later they go to their everyday life and the usual patterns come back.
This is not a black and white thing. All medicines can have good applications and have side effects and be dangerous in the wrong circumstance.
Feeling that we are less safe than we actually are, feeling threatened on some level and feeling that we have to be in control, in charge. This can be seen from the individual dimension to the collective dimension. What was happening between the United States and the Soviet Union, where we produced so many atomic missiles that 1% of it would be used, it would be all over. We want to be so safe that we actually create a very unsafe world. So a lot of this kind of inauthentic tendencies, the tendency to constantly have more of what we have, need to double, triple the gross national product as something that's guaranteed a good living standard, is just a fallacy. The countries that have achieved that have achieved a high level of economic standard, don't necessarily benefit from it emotionally. Actually, there's more violence, there's more suicide, there's more alcoholism, addiction, divorce, and so on. So there is no connection, direct connection between economic achievement and sense of well-being. We're all in it together, and we are kind of synergistically looking for answers in a way that involves, a lot of the deeper wisdom that comes from self-exploration, self-understanding.
Enantiodromia, the process by which something is transformed into or revealed as being the same as its opposite.
So the idea is to work on the body, to work on the heart, to work on the vital world, so that those structures become more porous and permeable to both energies, the energy of life and the energy of consciousness. And it is the alignment between those two energies what we are finding and have been finding that is extremely powerful for this kind of more holistic transformation of everyday life.
As soon as I'd had one experience, I thought this is by far the most interesting thing that I've ever come across, that I could ever imagine happening. It changes radically the way you look at it and think about reality forever afterwards. It doesn't necessarily make you enlightened, not at all, but it changes and enlarges your perception and your perspective and your understanding.
It's more critical now than ever because we do have even more devastating technologies, more hatred going on right now. It's a pivotal time in the world. So I hope the beauty of these experiences be our source of inspiration and healing as we move forward.
Science has verified that the mystical experience is repeatable. And so now we have a basis. Now we have an injunctive religion, a truth that can be tested and has already been tested in the court of science. And you can't get more proof than that, except taking it yourself.
How do we collectively dream, and how do we begin to co-create a better dream for the future of humanity? And I think that's our challenge and our opportunity as we live at this time of convergence where there are so many different worldviews and belief systems and ways of engaging reality. How do we seek that as an opportunity for creative convergence and the articulation and sharing of some new stories, some new dreams about our future possibilities?
The key, in my opinion, would be to facilitate the rapid connectivity of that which is emergent, creative, right now.
Goethe, who said that one person by themselves can accomplish little, but the person who unites him or herself with others at the right time can accomplish great deeds.
I think Jung had a very, very important idea that we should somehow live, part of our life internally. We should do deep self-exploration, which also means transformation, and then combine somehow in our everyday life the deep knowledge and wisdom that would come from these inner states.
And so the announcement needs to go forth. The quest is on. The journey is about to begin.